Cannibalism is a rather well-documented act in humans in ancient and modern times. It was once believed to only occur during times of extreme food shortages, but we now know that is not always the case. Yes, Jeffrey Dahmer, I'm looking at you. So in today's video, I'm going to share with you some of these heinous acts. These are the most shocking cannibal stories. Your discretion is advised. In 2001, a German man by the name of Armin Meiwes posted an ad online asking for a willing volunteer to be slaughtered and consumed. He specifically wanted a well-built 18 to 25-year-old, and after receiving multiple replies, many of which backed out, he decided on 43-year-old engineer Bernd Jorgen Armando Brands in March of the same year. After arriving at Meiwes' house, the two decided to make a videotape of what would be one of the most bizarre places to start this consensual act of cannibalism. In this video, which has never been made available to the public, Meiwes begins to amputate Brand's genitalia so they can eat it together. Before doing so, Brands takes 20 sleeping pills and drinks a bottle of cough syrup. I guess they thought this would put Brands in a state so he wouldn't feel as much pain. Regardless, Brands insisted that Meiwes should bite it off, but this didn't work, so he used a knife to cut it off instead. Brands then attempted to eat his own genitalia raw, but couldn't as it was too tough and chewy, as he put it. Meiwes then decides to fry Brand's genitalia in a pan with some of his fat, but ends up cooking it too long and it burns as a result. He then chopped up a few pieces and fed it to his dog. At this point, Brands has lost so much blood that he's too weak to even consume any of his fried genitalia. Meiwes then runs a bath for Brands and checks in on him every 15 minutes or so as he lays bleeding out, drifting in and out of consciousness. Meanwhile, he's just chilling in the other room reading Star Trek. After contemplating for a bit, Meiwes proceeds to kill Brands by stabbing him in the throat. He then hangs him up on a meat hook and over the next 10 months dismembers and eats his corpse. Over this time, it is said that he consumed over 40 pounds of Brands' flesh, storing his body parts in his freezer under pizza boxes to hide the evidence. According to prosecutors, this entire act was committed for sexual pleasure. After posting another ad online, Meiwes was arrested in December of 2002 after authorities were alerted of a tip from a college student. After searching his home, they found body parts and the 4-hour videotape of the entire murder. He was diagnosed with a schizoid personality and deemed fit to stand trial. On January 30th of 2004, he was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 8.5 years in prison. And in April of 2005, the court ordered a retrial as prosecutors argued he should have been convicted of murder because he killed for sexual gratification. Arguing the original trial ignored the significance of the video, which shows Meiwes killing because he wanted to, not because he was asked to. On May 10, 2006, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. It is said that during this time in prison, Meiwes regularly attends church service and has since become a vegetarian. Ironic if you ask me. In Russian law, Article 40, Section 158 states an individual who commits a murder before reaching the age of 18 may not be sentenced to more than 10 years imprisonment. This goes for any crime no matter how heinous the act. And while you may argue that criminals can be reformed, there is a very stark difference between theft and murder. This is the story of the Yaroslavl Satanists. Quick disclaimer, due to the complexity of the names, I'll most likely just stick to the first names for most of them for this story, so I don't butcher anything. Cool? Alright, let's roll. In 2006, 15-year-old Konstantin set out to build a sect of Satanists, and within a year, he brought on 5 other members, their names being Nikolai, Alexei, Anton, Sergei, and Alexander. They would carry out blood rituals with cats, dogs, and initiate any new members in the blood of the animals. All of this would be carried out in a vacant lot they found behind Fifth Tarfany Lane in a district in Yaroslavl. There, they made an inverted cross, which they would tie the corpses of the animals to and burn. By 2008, the sect continued to grow, and Konstantin fell in love with a new member named Sesnia, who went by the name Kara. She would be the first member of the group to be initiated with human blood, as the Satanists had graduated from killing animals to now killing humans. The first 2 victims would be Anya and Olya, who Alexei had met at school. After being introduced to Anton, Anya fell in love with him. It was even being reported that they had kissed a couple of weeks before the murder. On June 28, 2008, the group had gathered at Nikolai's apartment to hang out and drink. After Anya and Olya were drunk enough, they took them to the ritual clearing. The Satanists aligned themselves in a pentagram shape and lit a fire in the center. Once the signal was initiated, they pounced on the two girls and stabbed them with daggers. Anton would then behead the bodies with a machete, and after, the group would take pictures with the heads on their phone. The corpses were then dismembered, with the breasts being cut off and the hearts and tongues were removed, which then they fried and ate after. With their first victims claimed, Kara was officially initiated with the blood of their victims, and the dismembered bodies were buried in several pits near their ritual clearing. The next day, on June 29th, they would initiate a new member named Alexei, so the next victims, Sorokin and Varya, were chosen for the ritual. Sorokin had started dating Varya, so she came along just to hang out. The plan continued just like last time, except this time Varya started to feel uncomfortable and wanted to leave. Kara basically gaslighted her, which calmed her down and made her want to stay. The group then attacked her and Sorokin in the same fashion as the last victims. Sorokin attempted to fight back, but was bested by their sheer numbers. Just like last time, they were beheaded and dismembered. It was said that Nikolai counted out as he stabbed the victims until he reached 666. An interesting tidbit here, but during the investigation, they would find out that the Satanists had special roles assigned to them. Alexei was the secretary, so he took notes and kept a book of the dead made from the skins of the victims. Nikolai was the warrior, so he would initiate the murders and cut the throats of the victims. And Anton was the organizer. He would come up with the details, plan the murders, and line everyone up in a pentagram for the rituals. So, the Satanists have now claimed 4 victims who are teenagers. So, where are all their parents in this? Well, a rock festival invasion had coincided with these events, so the parents of the victims just believed that they were all going to that. It wouldn't be until early July after the festival had passed where they would kind of start questioning, where are my children? Why have they not returned? After writing statements to the police, they pretty quickly got on the tails of the founding members of the sect. But they all claimed they didn't know each other and deleted each other's numbers from their phones. To confuse the investigators further, when they did communicate, they would write the words in their messages backwards. After several days, Konstantin was the first to crack. He showed the police where they had all the dismembered corpses, and soon after, everyone else gave up too. The hardest person to capture was Anton, who faked a schizophrenic episode in front of an ambulance in an attempt to be taken to a mental hospital instead of prison. The police ultimately followed the ambulance and still took him in for questioning. Due to the bodies being mutilated and dismembered, investigators had to conduct a lot of examinations to properly determine whose parts belonged to each person. It wouldn't be until July 26, 2010 that the Satanists would be found guilty of their crimes. Nikolai would be tried as an adult, so he would receive 20 years in a maximum security colony, with the first 5 in prison. The founder Konstantin and Alexander would be sentenced to 10 years in our general regiment colony. Alexei and Alexei were given 9 years in General Regiment Colony, Kara would get 8 years in General Regiment Colony, and Sergei would only get 2 years in Penal Colony as he did not directly participate in the murders. Anton, on the other hand, would get what he wanted and was declared insane, so he did not have to go to jail and was instead sent to an establishment for treatment. Fast forwarding present day 2024, everyone has been released except Nikolai and are living normal lives as if nothing ever happened, getting a second chance at life after taking the lives of multiple others. What a load of absolute bullshit, if you ask me. Could you imagine killing 2 people, being convicted, spending 13 years behind bars, and then being allowed to roam free again? Surely there's no reason to suspect you'd kill again, right? I'm not gonna say the justice system fucked up here, but they fucked up. This story is about Edward Selznick, a guy you would not want to be drinking buddies with. Born in 1969 in Arkhangelsk, Russia, Edward never got to know his parents and was sent to a boarding school at a young age. It was said that he was slow, uninterested, and a habitual smoker at a young age who constantly engaged in thefts. After 8th grade, he went to a vocational school where he went to learn how to be a bricklayer and graduated in 1984. To make ends meet, he would work any little side job he could find and lived in a rundown hostel. He was convicted of embezzlement on several occasions, and in 2000, he didn't have anywhere to go. He's now jobless, homeless, and living between shelters and unlocked basements. Edward claims he was hearing voices, and in 2002 would be convicted of a double murder, thus serving 13 years until his eventual release in September of 2015. With 0 money to his name and no place to stay, he resorted to living on the streets where he would kill animals and eat their corpses to survive. It wouldn't be until March of 2016 where Edward would claim his next victim. Living in a homeless shelter, Edward shared a room with another homeless man. One day, he decided to stab that man with a knife, dismembering the rest of his remains with an axe. Edward was missing quite a bit of teeth, so he couldn't eat hardened foods. So he rectified this by liquefying some of his remains and then drinking it. The rest he put in garbage bags and then threw them in the river. In March of 2018, he met a man who had an apartment, and just like the homeless man, he killed and cannibalized him in the same manner. Only difference here is he threw remains in a lake instead of a river. He decided to keep the apartment for himself and got a job at the local meat processing plant. I assume this was so he could afford to pay the rent and then wouldn't have any issues with the landlord. After not being able to get in contact with the latest victim, his family made a trip over to the apartment to see why he wasn't responding to them, only to find Edward instead. When they questioned him about the man's whereabouts, he made up a bogus story that he left rent money and then moved to St. Petersburg, where he had gotten a new job. Skeptical of the story, they came in to inspect and noticed some odd-looking meat in the fridge, which Edward tried to say was just fish. After finding a jacket in the apartment with Edward's password, which he previously said he had no personal identification on this person, and a bank card with an unrecognized name, which would later be identified as the third murder, the man's father alerted the police. After being arrested and several interrogations, Edward eventually confessed to killing 3 drinking buddies over the past 2 years by stabbing them in their sleep, chopping their body parts up with an axe, and cannibalizing some of their remains, and then throwing the rest in different bodies of water around the area. His motive was not only the voices, but after eating so many animals, he began to have a craving for human flesh. He was sent to a psychiatric hospital for examination, but was deemed sane and aware of his actions. The trial began on January 13, 2020, and on March 16, 2020, Edward was sentenced to life imprisonment and ordered to pay 1 million rubles in restitution to the victims' families. The McDonald triad is a theory that suggests if you have 2 of 3 specific factors, you have a higher chance of having violent tendencies in relation to serial offenses. Those 3 factors being cruelty to animals, obsession with fire setting, and excessive bedwetting in your childhood. In the case of our next story, Richard Chase would exhibit all 3 of these by age 5. Although it is a theory, in this instance, it was all but proven right. Born on May 23, 1950 in Sacramento, California, it was said he had an abusive childhood. His father would beat him and his younger sister rather frequently. As Chase got older, he became a heavy drug addict by his teen years. During this time, it was said Chase had problems getting erections during intercourse, which prompted him to see a psychiatrist. He was told he may have a mental illness, and the reason he can't get an erection most likely is due to his bottled up anger. At age 18, he moved out of his parents' home, and things got crazy. Chase went through several roommates as they were concerned about his heavy drug use. He was constantly under the influence of LSD, weed, and alcohol. With nowhere left to go, he moved back in with his mother, who was now divorced from his father. I can't say for certain if it was the heavy drug use or if it was him being mentally ill or hell, a combination of both, but he started to become extremely paranoid, going as far as to shave his head because he believed his cranial bones were moving around under his skin. Convinced his mother was trying to poison him, he decided to move out again and get an apartment that his father was paying for. Now this is where things start to get really weird, and it wouldn't be discovered until later why Chase was doing this, or at least what he claims is the reason he was doing it, but he began catching animals, gutting them, then blending them with Coca-Cola to drink. In 1975, he was involuntarily institutionalized due to injecting rabbit blood in his veins. He was diagnosed with severe schizophrenia, but didn't react to the antipsychotic medication he was given, so it was concluded the mental issues were from years of drug use. He earned the nickname Dracula from the staff because of his fixation with blood. He once broke the necks of birds he caught from his window and drank their blood. He even used stolen syringes to extract blood from the therapy dogs. By 1976, Chase was deemed no longer a danger to society, so he was released back into his mother's custody. She helped him wean off his medicine and moved him into his own apartment. During this time, he continued to torture animals, which his mom was witness to when she came over to visit and saw Chase tear open a dead cat, only to then smother himself in its blood. On December 29, 1977, Ambrose Griffin would be returning home from a shopping trip when he would suddenly fall to the ground after helping his wife get the bags from the car. Chase had officially claimed his first victim in a random drive-by shooting. Less than a month later, on January 23, 1978, a pregnant woman by the name of Teresa Wallen would be taking out the trash. When she returned, she would be shot 3 times and stabbed with a butcher knife. Chase had snuck in through the unlocked front door and claimed his second victim. He then proceeded to rape her and mutilate her by cutting off her nipples and removing her internal organs. He drank her blood and smeared the rest on the walls. It was also reported he stuffed dog feces from her yard down her throat before leaving. With the taste for human blood, it would only be 4 days later on January 27, 1978, that he would claim his next victims. Chase went around checking homes for unlocked doors and found the door unlocked of Evelyn Meredith. He first found her friend Dan Meredith in the hallway, which he killed with one shot to the head. Evelyn was also killed by a gunshot to her head and was found on her bed, believed to be raped after she had been murdered. Her stomach had been cut open and blood removed. Her 6-year-old Jason was also found in her room with 2 gunshots to his head. Luckily, his body was still fully intact. Chase had left an absolute mess of the crime scene with bloody footprints all over the house. He stole Dan's car and ditched it a few yards from his apartment. Unbeknownst to Chase, he had made an even bigger mistake several days prior. Before he murdered Teresa Wallen, he broke into the Edwards family home a few days earlier. He defecated in their infant's bed and was run off by Robert Edwards while wearing an orange parka. That same day, he went shopping and saw a childhood friend who he recognized while wearing that same orange parka. She thought he was weird and didn't think anything of their meeting until she realized his orange parka matched the same one in the description for the uncaptured killer, and contacted the police with this information. After running a background check on Chase, they found he had a .22 caliber gun registered in his name, which is the same shell casing size found at the crime scenes. On the same day of January 27th, the police went to Chase's apartment to question him, but he refused to open the door. The police hid in the hallway, and once Chase came out, they arrested him. Lo and behold, he was wearing the same orange parka and had Dan Meredith's wallet on him. Everything, and I mean everything, was covered in blood. The walls, the floors, utensils, everything. As they searched his place, they found the brain of Evelyn's 22-month-old son David, who was missing from the crime scene, and in a container were his body parts wrapped in plastic. His mutilated body wouldn't be found until months later, but it was dumped at a nearby church. Also found in the apartment were parts of Teresa Wallen and Evelyn Meredith in the fridge, as well as multiple pet collars on the counter. Robert Chase was finally apprehended, and on May 8, 1979, he was found guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder, resulting in being sentenced to die in the gas chamber. While awaiting death row, Chase was allowed to do a series of interviews with Robert K. Ressler, and this is where his true intentions were revealed. Chase claimed the killings were not his fault and he needed blood to cure his condition with his stomach, a condition that didn't exist. Oh yeah, did I totally forget to mention Chase was a hypochondriac? Yeah, this coupled with his paranoid psychotic personality was a recipe for disaster. He believed Nazis and UFOs were after him, as well as poisoning his food. He went as far as asking for access to a radar gun so he could apprehend the Nazi UFOs and have them stand trial for the murders. He also wrote a note to the President of the United States asking to be transferred to a hospital on the East Coast so he could be closer to the government and further away from the UFOs. This was denied for obvious reasons, and Chase would be found dead in his cell on December 26, 1980, after having saved up on his antidepressants for weeks and overdosing by taking them all at once. Although Robert Chase had no definitive pattern to his crimes, the FBI still uses his story as a case study for disorganized killings. When a gypsy fortune teller tells you that you will marry and have children, but all your children will die, I feel like most people would say that's crazy talk and write them off. But for Leonarda, she took this literally and maybe for good reason. This is the woman we are talking about that had 17 pregnancies resulting in 3 miscarriages and 10 dying at extremely young ages. She vowed to protect the 4 surviving children with every piece of her being. But the way in which she went about it was quite bizarre. This is the story of the soap maker of Correggio. Born on April 14, 1893 in a small city called Montella, which was at the time called the Kingdom of Italy, Leonarda was no stranger to mental health issues, attempting to commit suicide twice within her youth. In 1917, she married a registry office nurse by the name of Raphael Pinsardi, a marriage in which her mother did not approve of, as she had plans for her to marry another man. Leonarda would later say her mother cursed them. Maybe this was the beginning of what the gypsy was referring to. In 1921, they moved to Raphael's hometown of Lara, where Leonarda would find herself in prison in 1927 for fraud. After getting released, the couple moved to Lacedonia, which was short-lived as their home was destroyed by an earthquake in 1930. So, they moved once more to Correggio, where Leonarda would open a small shop, a place where Leonarda will become a popular and well-respected person in their neighborhood. In 1939, Italy's entry into the war was becoming increasingly imminent, which made Leonarda's favorite and eldest son Giuseppe decide to join the war. Remembering what the gypsy had once told her, Leonarda knew what she had to do. She vowed to protect her 4 surviving children at all costs. The only option to save her son's life was human sacrifices. Convinced there was no other way, she had the perfect victims. Leonardo had 3 friends in the neighborhood which were middle-aged women. Seemingly easy targets, the first of which would be Faustina Seti, who had come to Leonardo asking for her to find a husband. Of course she agreed and said she found her a husband in Pola, but she couldn't tell anyone. The day of departure had arrived, but of course Seti would never make it to Pola. She actually wouldn't even make it out of the neighborhood. When Seti arrived at Leonardo's place, she was killed with an axe and dragged into a closet where she was then cut into 9 parts and her body was gathered into a basin. She then proceeded to put the pieces in a pot with 7 kilos of caustic soda and stirred until the pieces dissolved into a thick, dark mush. This was poured into several buckets and emptied into a septic tank. As for her blood, Leonardo used that to make crunchy tea cakes, which she served to the ladies who came to visit, as well as sharing them with her son Giuseppe, who was seemingly unaware of the true contents. Her next victim would come on September 5th, 1940 in the form of Francesca Sovi. Leonardo had claimed to have found her a job at a school for girls in Piacenza. Just like her last murder, Francesca had come to visit her before her departure. This time around, she gave her drugged wine and then killed her with an axe, disposing of the body in the same way she did with Seti's. Leonardo's third and final victim would be Virginia Cacioppo on September 30th, 1940. This time she told her that she found a job as a secretary in Florence. This would follow the same pattern as the last 2 murders, but this time with an extra step. Due to her flesh and fat being white, she added a bottle of cologne and made Virginia into soap bars, which she then gave to her neighbors and friends. Leonardo even went as far as saying the woman, which was really sweet, made the cake even better. Virginia's sister-in-law became suspicious and has last seen her entering Leonardo's house, which she then reported to the superintendent of police in Reggio Emilia. After opening an investigation, Leonardo was arrested but refused to confess to the murders. It wasn't until the blame was shifted to her son Giuseppe when she decided to be compliant and commit to the heinous acts she had done. In 1946, she was tried for the murders and found guilty, being sentenced to 30 years in prison and 3 years in a criminal asylum, where she actually ended up dying from cerebral apoplexy on October 15, 1970. If you ever want to see the pot that the victims were boiled in, it is on display at the Criminological Museum in Rome. For me, I think I'll personally pass on that one. In the 1910s, the Ottoman Empire town of Mosul was experiencing a devastating famine. Due to the lack of rain in 1916, farming would become damn near impossible, and the prices would begin to rise with the scarcity of agricultural products. With inflation being at an all-time high, unless you were rich, there was absolutely no way for you to afford a little flour or even a bushel of wheat. This led to a time of violent crime and eating stray animals. As the money dwindled and the animals ran out, there was nothing left to eat until Abboud and his wife Khawaja came up with an idea that will result in them becoming one of the worst criminals in the country's history. The plan was simple: lure potential victims back to their place, kill them, and then cook them. They'll have full bellies, and with all the crime happening, surely they wouldn't get caught, right? I guess you'll just have to wait and see. Their first murder would be committed in 1917 when their elderly neighbor came to visit them. Being in the comfort of their own home, it was time to strike. Abboud grabbed the knife and stabbed her from behind. With the help of his wife, they began to butcher her and then cooked her meat. According to Khawaja, the taste was awful. They spent the entire night vomiting from this experience. It wasn't until the next day when Khawaja told her husband that maybe the meat was bad since she was so old. So instead, we should kill children as the meat would taste much better. They agreed, but were puzzled how they would get these children without being noticed. After some thought, they decided to use their young son to lure the victims back to their place. All he had to do was go out, play with the local kids in the neighborhood, and then bring them back to his place so they could continue to play. Once they arrived, his parents would bludgeon the kids to death, butcher them, and eat them as a family. Reports are conflicting, but they either had a well in their backyard or a man-made hole in the basement, and that's how they would dispose of the bones. Due to the famine, the disappearances would not be noticed by the public and completely ignored by the authorities. Now, with an abundance of meat at their disposal, Abboud would be able to reopen his restaurant and begin to sell the meat for a cheap price. With the inflation, people loved having an option for a cheap meal. But this, my friends, is where it all would backfire. A customer decided to purchase some stew from them and noticed something odd. Being a butcher by trade himself, he quickly realized this was a child's finger. Without raising suspicions and being aware of the ever-increasing disappearances in the area, he decided to inform the police of the matter. Without any hesitation, they raided the home and restaurant, finding at least 100 skulls from the victims that they had slain. With a mountain of evidence against them and the confession from Khawaja, the trial was short and they were sentenced to death. On the morning of their execution, they were paraded on donkeys to Bab al-Tab Square, where makeshift gallows waited so they could answer for their crimes. The bystanders cursed, spit, and assaulted the couple as they rode to their demise, with a report going as far as saying a woman whose 3 children had been killed by them bit off one of Khawaja's toes. As they arrived at the gallows before a large crowd, the couple was hanged in a public display that would still never be able to equal the pain and suffering they caused these countless families. Future US President George H.W. Bush and 8 other airmen were shot down in September of 1944 during bombing raids on Chichijima during World War II. Of these 9 pilots, George H.W. Bush would be the only one to evade capture. The other 8 were not so lucky and were not prepared for what would become of their livelihoods. This is the Chichijima Incident. As World War II continued, the Japanese showed no signs of letting up. Before the atomic bomb was dropped almost a year later, in an attempt to end the war quickly and with the least number of casualties, Allied forces started to strategically blockade key areas to cut off resources and supplies, and regularly bombing this little island as an invasion would have been costly. As this happened, the daily rice ration was cut from 400 grams to 240 grams per person. Now at this time, the troops weren't necessarily at any risk of starvation, but 8 perfectly ripe POWs just dropped on their doorstep. I just want to be clear that this is probably what they were thinking, not me, because what else would be going through your mind was what was going to happen next. Many of the prisoners would be tortured or executed, but this time would be different. Tachibana ordered for them to be beheaded, and 4 of them were executed specifically for the purpose of being consumed. Flesh would be removed from their thighs and livers and served as delicacies. It was apparently done for both physical and spiritual benefits, as well as to show dominance as revenge for the bombings. The surgeons would strategically remove the meat, and the cooks would prepare the dishes with soy sauce and vegetables. They genuinely believed the dish was good for the stomach. After the war, Tachibana and his staff were arrested in 1946 in relation to this incident by the American occupation authorities and deported to Guam, where they would stand trial for their war crimes. At this time, cannibalism was not covered under international law, so they were charged with prevention of honorable burial. Tachibana and the other defendants were executed by hanging and buried in unmarked graves. It wouldn't be until 2003 when the book Flyboys, A True Story of Courage by James Bradley released that the public, the family of the victims, and even George H.W. Bush himself would become aware of the war crimes committed in Chichijima. He said his victim count was over 100 and he boasted he had children in every state. He killed, raped, molested, and cannibalized his victims, many of which are still unsolved to this day. This, my friends, is a story of the Gray Man himself, Albert Fish. Born May 19, 1870 as Hamilton Howard Fish, his father suffered a fatal heart attack when he was 5, causing his mother to put him in foster care. During his time in St. John's Orphanage, Fish was frequently physically and verbally abused, causing him to go by his dead sibling's name Albert to escape the nickname he had been given, a ham and eggs. And during almost daily beatings, Fish started to enjoy the physical pain, almost looking forward to getting beat. It wasn't until 5 years later his mother would secure a decent job with the government and was able to remove him from that orphanage. 2 years later, in 1982, Fish got into a relationship with a telegraph boy who introduced him to drinking urine and eating feces. During this time, he would frequent public bathhouses on the weekends just to watch the boys undress. In 1890, Fish decided to move to New York City and become a male prostitute. At this point, he began molesting and raping young boys who were more often than not 6 years or younger. While most likely not being aware of his sexuality, his mother arranged for him to be married, and in 1898, he married Anna Marie Hoffman, whom he had 6 children with. Fish said at some point during this, he had a secret male lover who took him to a wax museum for a date. After seeing the bisection of a male's genitals, he became obsessed with sexual mutilation. As bad as all of this is already, we still haven't even scratched the surface of what Fish was capable of. Other than Fish going to Sing Sing prison for a few years in 1903 for grand larceny, not much is known about his life between the years of 1890 to 1910. But his next crime when Fish was 40 was when his true color started to show. In 1910, Fish had met a 19-year-old named Thomas Bedden while working in Delaware, with whom he began to have a sadomasochistic relationship. It is said that Bedden was intellectually disabled, and Fish decided to take full advantage. 10 days into the relationship, Fish took Bedden to an old farmhouse and tortured him for weeks. The original intention was to kill Bedden, chop him up, and take him home. But with the hot weather, I'm sure the smell would have attracted attention. So instead, he cut off half of Bedden's penis, poured peroxide over the wound, and wrapped it in a Vaseline-covered handkerchief, left a $10 bill, and took the first train out of there. Unfortunately, there isn't any information on if Bedden survived or not. Remember that arranged marriage Fish had? Well, she decided to leave him in January of 1917 for another man, taking nearly every possession they owned and leaving Fish to become a single parent. This is where we start to see Fish start to break mentally. He's starting to have hallucinations and begins to self-harm. It is later revealed after his eventual arrest, X-rays showed 29 needles lodged in his pelvis, and if that wasn't enough, he would beat himself with a nail-studded paddle and burn wool he had shoved into his anus. And even throughout all of this, there isn't any concrete evidence that he harmed his children. It's said he had his kids and their friends spank him with the nail-studded paddle he would typically abuse himself with. Speaking of children, over the next 10 years, Fish's mental health would continue to decline. Now suffering from psychosis, he felt he was being commanded by God to torture and sexually mutilate children. He would pay local boys to bring him other children that he would molest, torture, mutilate, and then murder, typically going for African Americans or the mentally disabled, as he felt they wouldn't be missed after being killed. Leading us to May 25th, 1928, when Fish saw an ad in the New York World from Edward Budd looking for work. The plan being simple: hire him, earn his trust, mutilate him, and leave him to bleed to death. But the plan quickly changed when at their first meeting, Fish met Edward's younger sister Grace. All attention now being shifted to her, he knew he had to have her. He made up a bogus story about having to attend his niece's birthday party and persuaded their parents to let him take her. A decision Edward and Grace's parents would come to regret. With Grace now in his possession, Fish already had his next place picked out for whoever his next victim would be. He took her to this abandoned house and strangled her to death, after which he decapitated her, dismembered her body, and spent the next several days eating most of her remains. The craziest part about this is Fish was the last person seen with Grace, and he didn't even get in trouble over this. Instead, a guy named Charles Edward Pope was accused by his estranged wife for Grace's disappearance. It ended up spending 108 days in jail until he was finally found not guilty. I cannot make up how bad this justice system failed here. It wouldn't be until November 1934 that Fish would incriminate himself by sending a letter to Grace's parents with a confession. In the letter, he starts with talking about his friend from 1894 who was a deckhand on the steamer Tacoma named Captain John Davis. Davis apparently sailed from San Francisco to Hong Kong, China, and during the time of famine there, they would eat children sold to butchers, going as far as saying a boy or girl behind, which is the sweetest part of the body and sold as veal cutlet, brought the highest price. He then goes on to admit his part in the disappearance of Grace, saying,
"He told me so often how good human flesh was, and I made up my mind to taste it. On June 3rd, 1928, I called on you at 406 West 15th Street and brought you pot cheese and strawberries. We had lunch. Grace sat on my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her. On the pretense of taking her to a party, you said yes, she could go. I took her to an empty house in Westchester I had already picked out. When we got there, I told her to remain outside. She picked wildflowers. I went upstairs and stripped all my clothes off. I knew if I did not, I would get her blood on them. When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in the closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run down the stairs. I grabbed her and she said she would tell her mama. First I stripped her naked. How she did kick, bite, and scratch. I choked her to death, and then cut her in small pieces so I could take the meat to my rooms, cook, and eat it. How sweet and tender her little ass was roasted in the oven. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. I did not fuck her, though I could have if I wished. She died a virgin.
Although the famine story with Captain Davis could never be confirmed, the police now had the evidence they needed to arrest Fish, and on December 13th, 1934, he was arrested for the murder of Grace Budd. The trial began on March 11, 1935, with Fish pleading insanity. The trial lasted only 10 days, and even though the jurors didn't doubt that he was insane, They agreed he should be executed regardless, so he was returned to Sing Sing prison once again, and on January 16, 1936, he was executed in the electric chair. He mutilated, cannibalized, and performed necrophilia on his victim's corpse over several days. And even with all of these proven acts, he was concluded sane and allowed to live among the public from age 37 to his eventual death in 2002 at the age of 73. This is the story of none other than Issei Sagawa. Born on April 26, 1949 in Kobe, Japan, his family was pretty well off, with his dad Akira Sagawa being president of Kurita Water Industries and his grandfather being an editor for one of the 5 biggest newspapers in Japan. Sagawa was born prematurely, reportedly small enough to fit in his dad's palm. Doctors didn't think he would survive since he developed enteritis, which is a disease of the small intestine. After several injections of potassium and calcium and saline, he eventually recovered. But due to his fragile health, he developed an introverted personality and had a strong interest in literature. Oh yeah, did I mention he was pretty well off? Throughout this story, I'm sure you'll see why being daddy's boy saved his ass more than once. In 2011, Sagawa had an interview with Vice claiming his first heinous act was committing bestiality on his dog when he was in his youth, which eventually led to his cannibalistic desires for women. There is no concrete evidence on this other than his words, so for the sake of this story, the first documented case of his crimes happened in 1973 when Sagawa was 24. Being small and frail, he had a yearning for tall and strong foreign women. At this time, he was attending Waka University in Tokyo, and one night he followed a tall German woman home with the intention of slicing off part of her buttocks, but his plan backfired. According to Sagawa, she pushed him to the ground, and he was charged with rape. Of course, he never told them what his true intentions were. It is said that his father paid off the victim, but that is not 100% confirmed. In 1977, Sagawa moved to Paris to pursue his PhD in literature, and it would be 4 years until he came up with his master plan. This plan involved his classmate, Renee Hartfeld. On June 11, 1981, Sagawa lured her to his apartment under the false pretense of translating poetry for a school assignment. After arriving, she began to read poetry, and at this moment, he would strike, shooting her in the neck with a rifle. According to Sagawa, he fainted from the shock of the shooting, but after he awoke, he knew he had to carry out his plan. He attempted to eat her right butt cheek, because the left is closer to the heart and apparently he doesn't like blood. I guess when you're this sick, you know what you want. His teeth were not sharp enough, so he left and bought a curved meat knife. When he got back, he started to carve up her body parts and consume various parts of her body raw and cooked. He even went as far as taking photos of her body during each stage of eating. June being one of the hottest times of the year in Paris, he knew he had to dump the rest of the body as it would have started to smell as it decomposed. Before he had done this heinous act, he had bought 2 suitcases, which he filled with her body parts. He attempted to dump the suitcases in a lake near his apartment, but was caught when a random passerby had opened the suitcase and saw the body parts. Sagawa walked away, and 4 days later, he was apprehended by the French police. Now you would think with all this evidence sitting right in front of you that this guy would have had the book thrown at him, but nope. Daddy's money bought Sagawa a lawyer, and after awaiting trial for 2 years, he was found legally insane and unfit to stand trial, which landed him in a mental institution held indefinitely, or so we thought. After being visited by Japanese author Unehiko Yamato, his account of the murder was published in Japan under the title In the Fog. With his newfound stardom, French authorities deported him to Japan, where he was examined by psychologists. With the charges in France being dropped and the record sealed, Japanese authorities couldn't hold him, and on August 12, 1986, Sagawa checked himself out and lived the rest of his life a free man. Sagawa himself has said that being forced to make a living while being known as a murderer and cannibal was terrible punishment, and claims to have later regretted the obsession, and to that, I say the justice system fucked up, and he got the best outcome you could get. Sure, getting a job and getting respect would be hard, but we have people who have stolen cars and gotten caught with drugs serving time, whereas you got to live your life outside amongst the general public as if nothing happened. Sorry, this story gets me a little heated every time I hear about it, but that is the story of Issei Sagawa. When the voices tell you to eat flesh and blood or else you'll die, I guess you must listen, right? Well, in the case of Marc Sappington, who would later be coined the Kansas City Vampire, this was exactly what happened. Between March and April of 2001, Marc would go on to kill 4 people, most of which were his acquaintances, with his lawyers blaming his history of schizophrenia and regular use of PCP and laced marijuana as the culprit. But how he got caught is the more interesting part. Marc was pretty well liked in Kansas City. He'd attend church every Sunday and was said to be bright and articulate. Around the age of 16, Marc and his friend Alton Brown would partake in drug use nearly every day, which led to Marc's behavior becoming erratic. Granted, he never hurt anyone or was violent, but the voices kept getting louder, and soon, he would give in. In February 2001, Marc met Armando Gayton, and together, they planned a robbery. On March 26, 2001, they put the plan into action and robbed David Marshak, owner of detail and auto sale shop Phase 1 Auto Sales. The plan was to scare him with a weapon and simply rob him. Marc, however, had a different plan and ended up shooting Marshak. At this point, Marc and Gayton both flee, with Gayton going to Texas and getting arrested. Fortunately for Marc, Gayton doesn't rat him out, and this leaves Marc on the run with the voices getting stronger and stronger. For weeks, Marc searched for the perfect victim, and on April 7, 2001, his friend Terry Green showed up on his doorstep. Unknowingly to Green at this time, he would become the perfect victim Marc was searching for. Marc then proceeds to lure Green to his backyard and stabs him 4 times. It was said the voices were momentarily satisfied, and as they began to taunt Marc, requesting more blood, he then bent Green over and started to drink his blood. Becoming paranoid that someone had seen what he did, Marc covers the body with the blue tarp and places it in the back of Green's car. He then drives the car from Kansas City, Kansas to Kansas City, Missouri, and parks the car in an antique small parking lot, which wouldn't be discovered until April 10, 2001. On that same day, Marc would claim 2 more victims, the first one being Michael Weaver. Weaver was the stepbrother of Marc's best friend Eric Phoenix. Phoenix's mother, Alice Wilson, was awakened early that morning with Marc knocking on the door claiming he needed a screwdriver. He then proceeded to watch TV for a bit with Wilson before heading upstairs to get a jacket. Roughly 10 minutes later, he came downstairs and ran out the back door. After leaving, he stayed in the backyard as the voices told him he needed to eat flesh. Weaver arrived minutes later in the backyard, and Marc stabbed Weaver through his back all the way through his chest. Weaver survived the attack and attempted to get away. He hopped in his car and crashed into a light pole, which allowed Marc to catch up. Marc heard sirens and attempted to move the car, which he ditched to the nearby alley. Weaver was found slumped over in the front seat, dead from bleeding out. The voices were still not satisfied, so a few hours later, Marc invited his friend Alton Brown to come over and smoke. He lured Brown into his basement and shot him in the back with a shotgun. Marc then proceeds to cut off Brown's leg and eat it, which he admitted made him sick. So he went upstairs and fried it and drank some of Brown's blood. He then used a maul and knife and dismembered the rest of the body. That same night, Anita Washington, a resident in the same neighborhood, was parking her car after returning from the grocery store. Marc walked up to her and knocked on her window with a gun pointed at her. She let him in the car and was instructed to drive him to Kansas City, Missouri. He kept muttering he was a dead man over and over. Eventually, he asked her to pull over so he could drive, at which point she ran away to the nearest house and called the police. Marc was apprehended 2 days later on April 12, 2001, in which he confessed to 3 homicides as well as the kidnapping. He then took detectives to where he dumped Weaver's t-shirt, his car keys, and Green's car keys. He was officially charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count each of kidnapping, and aggravated burglary, landing this monster 3 life terms for the first-degree murders, 79 months for the kidnapping, and 32 months for the aggravated burglary. If you made it to the end of today's video, we genuinely want to thank you. So much time and effort goes into the research and the editing on a video like this. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe and hit that like button if you enjoyed today's video. Also, be sure to comment if there's any topics you want us to cover in the near future. Until next time, take care and try not to trip down another rabbit hole.